He ran his hand along the carved marble, feeling the cold bite of it through his cuff. For a man who had built hotels and coffee shops and entire streets where there were once empty lots, Raphael Anderson still had a habit of touching things, surfaces that proved solidity, edges that confirmed reality. The chapel bells were tuned to perfection that day, each peal falling like a promise. Around him, cameras blinked politely, chairs gleamed. The floral arches smelled of gardenia and expensive restraints. He smiled because he was supposed to smile, because the world expected the billionaire to smile on his wedding day. Then a small shape collided with that world. A girl the color of a shadow at dusk burst across the aisle, sneakers squeaking on marble, hair matted, one sleeve torn. She did not fit the photograph on any invitation. She did not belong in the cadre of polished relatives or the glossy pages of society magazines. She was a child, 12 years old, and she grabbed Raphael's hand with a force that made his ring finger sting. The sound in the room changed. It was as if someone had cut the string to a giant. Invisible instrument music halted mid-measure, and the breath of 200 people stopped with it. "Don't marry her, it's a trap," she said, voice thin but steady. The words seemed to overspill the smallness of her body, as if they were too large to be contained inside a person who slept on church floors and carried her belongings in a plastic bag. The bride's smile froze. The choir soprano faltered. A woman in pearls clutched her pocketbook like an apology. Security moved, polite and practiced, but uncertain what to do with a child at the center of a billion-dollar spectacle. For a beat that felt like a heartbeat stretched to breaking, everyone looked at Raphael. He looked at the girl. He looked at his fiancée. He looked at the held breath of the room, and the fragile, sudden absence of certainty that had been his life for a long time. Then he lowered his hand, and the rest of the story, everything that followed, was launched from that simple, human pause. If you enjoy true feeling stories like this one, like and subscribe. Just a quick line, and we'll keep going. Raphael Anderson made a fortune the way most epic stories say fortunes are made, by refusing to see a limit where everyone else did. He bought rundown blocks and filled them with bright, hard-working people who opened restaurants, bakeries, and small inns. He bought a near-bankrupt coffee roaster and turned the blend into a habit that people carried in their pockets. He started the Anderson Foundation after his wife, Mara, died. He called it a foundation but thought of it as a set of promises. After Mara, he would make something that outlived his grief and did not leave him alone. Newspapers called him a self-made billionaire. Interviews found him measured and a little guarded, the way men who have lost someone precious sometimes are. He rarely spoke about love on camera, but there were photographs at festivals, handing out coats at the ribbon cuttings for after-school programs. He had a face that was kind, in a careful way, the kind of kindness that gave you a scarf, but did not ask the world for your trust lightly. In private, he kept photographs of Mara in frames that never moved from room to room. They lived in a house that could sometimes feel like an echo chamber of memories. When the world suggested he could finally try again, he let it. Clara Brown moved like sunlight around the edges of rooms. She was 35, tall, practiced at laughter, and immaculate in a way that made stylists sigh. Society loved her. She made speeches about empowerment and posed with donors at fundraisers. She was the exact kind of partner the papers would approve of, a polished complement to his rough edges, a woman who wore his publicness with grace. Only some of the pieces people see are the pieces people get to keep. Across town, where plaster peels like a tired map and the night smells of fryer oil and diesel, Lena knew Raphael in a different way. She knew the Anderson vans that rolled in on Mondays, the volunteers who served soup, the volunteers who sometimes smiled in a manner that told her she was seen. She had been sleeping in St. Michael's beneath its high pews and beneath the stained glass saints for 2 years. The church smelled of incense and dust and old prayers. She kept a thin blanket, folded like a promise, and a cracked phone that could barely hold a charge, and a small bag of things she couldn't quite name. She was 12 and measured the world with the wariness of someone twice her age. Her life on the streets had a rhythm. Mornings were for finding warmth and sometimes a paper cup of coffee from a cafe that tipped out a little extra. Afternoons were for looking at the world and at people. Evenings were for church, when the light poured through glass angels and the pews made a shelter. Nights she counted the muffled sounds of the city as if they were notes in a lullaby that never quite allowed sleep. She learned how to be small when it mattered, and how to be loud when it mattered more. Lena had learned the faces of the foundation the way others learned the faces of family. She knew the volunteer who always carried bandages in a tin. She knew the driver whose laugh came out like a punctuation mark. She knew Mrs. Thompson, the foundation assistant who organized shoes and smiles with meticulous tenderness. She had been given a sandwich by the foundation on her worst day and a blanket on the coldest winter night. She would never forget those things. Gratitude, for someone who sleeps with one eye open, can feel like an anchor. The sacristy at St. Michael's had a back door that squealed if you pushed it too quickly, and a stack of hymnals people used like legal pads. It was not meant to be a place for secrets, but shadows prefer service rooms. They find them warm and quiet. On a late Tuesday, Lena had been tidying the corner where they kept the choir robes when she saw a sliver of movement in the doorway and heard the sound of voices low and urgent. She pressed herself behind a stack of old hymn books and listened. The plot unfolded in ordinary voices. Clara's laugh was there, oily with confidence. A man Lena later learned was Clara's lawyer. Tom Bland, precise, spoke in terms that made Lena's stomach hollow. There was another voice, with more edge to it, someone from a business Raphael trusted in name, who had been at a ribbon cutting last year and had shared that photo, the one with the champagne and perfect teeth. Lena did not understand every technical phrase they used. She had limited access to the language of contracts, but she knew the rhythm of betrayal when she heard it. They spoke of consolidation and transfer and clearing the accounts. They spoke about a marriage that would not be for love, but for access. The plan was elegant because it was cruel. Marry Raphael. Get him to sign the right documents in the moment between vows and honeymoon. Secure power of attorney. Then execute a transfer of ownership to shell entities that would quietly move funds and authority out of his reach. The foundation, his promise, would become a line item in their calculations, a resource to be redirected. Someone in the doorway said, "Once he signs, everything shifts. It's just paperwork. 10 days, and it's untouchable. We'll have them all reconciled. No messy heirs, no prying hands." Lena's heart hammered in a way that made her cherubed breath catch. They talked about dates, about a chapel ceremony with familiar guests, about a cake large enough to distract. They spoke about Raphael the way one speaks about a tree to be harvested strong, beautiful, and stationary. Clara's voice, when it came back, was soft as icing. "He's naive in that way. That makes him easy to love and easier to secure. Keep the charm. Let me do the rest." The words were a net. Lena had never imagined they would sling one over her life and pull it taut. For 2 years she had known the kindness of Anderson tents and the quiet of a foundation that meant good things for kids like her. She could feel her gratitude coiling into terror. If Raphael lost control of the foundation, where would the kids go? Who would hand out coats? Who would give a stray child a sandwich and a kind word? After they left, Lena stayed where she was until the church grew dim and the heating kicked into a low complaint. Her fingers trembled as she dug in her bag for the cracked phone. The screen was spider-webbed. The casing had been taped 3 times and still creaked. It only held 5 minutes of battery in its best days, and it had a voice recorder that sometimes worked if you cleared the dust. She set it near the crack under the sacristy door and pressed record. She did it because she could not sleep with the image of those men discussing the future that did not include the people who needed help. She set the phone where sound could leak through and hoped the tiny plastic device would catch enough to mean something. The phone caught voices like a trapped bird catches the room in a single beat. There was the hush of papers being shuffled, a laugh with too many teeth, the lawyer's dry certainty, and Clara's sweet cruelty. Lena listened again, later, to the file, when she had the courage to play it back in a pew where moonlight pooled like forgiveness. The recording was cracked in places and had a steady hiss that rose like sea foam, but the core was there. "Once he signs the transfer, we control the accounts," the lawyer said, voice flat. "Power of attorney gives you what you need. Remove the board, reassigned." "We make it seem inevitable," Clara answered, the air in her voice like sugar and glass. We surround him with everything he loves and make the right legal calls. He will believe it's for the children. He always does. That will be the cover. It's clean, the business partner added. Most will never read the small print. We make the donation look like altruism, and the donors congratulate the system. Those bits of dialogue replayed in Lena's mind like glass images, beautiful but dangerous. She knew what the words meant in the bones of her life. She knew what it meant for an order to move power out of hands that had used it to shelter and feed, and to place it into the hands of people who used shelter and food as ledger lines. She could run to Raphael. She could hand the recording to Mrs. Thompson or to a journalist. She could do any number of things that might seem sensible on a map drawn by someone with a cozy bed and a phone that charged every night, but Lena's map was different. People like her are often not believed. Small hands do not carry great proofs in courtrooms. When she approached volunteers with stories before, they had fed her and then have. The idea of walking into a billionaire's office with a tangle of cords and a ragged file felt like trying to sail a paper boat across the ocean. She chose instead to become a seam in the fabric of the plan, a thread that might pull the whole pattern loose at the pivotal moment. The days before the wedding felt like an intake of breath for the city. Invitations had been sent in gold envelopes. Floral arrangements were rehearsed until every petal sat like punctuation. Vendors confirmed orders. The Anderson hotels booked rooms for out-of-town guests. Reporters waited outside the private chapel gates. People speculated in columns about which chair the billionaire would occupy in his life now, as if love had the same font as a headline. Raphael moved in an orbit of rehearsed calm. He answered questions with a gentle deflection, saying that he was focused on family and on preserving what Mara had cared for. He did not suspect Clara of treachery. He saw the world in structures and projects and tended to believe that most plans were built on earnestness. That perception was why people trusted him and why people like Clara saw him as a resource. Lena watched from near and far. She sat in corners and watched floral deliveries like a spy who could not afford a disguise. She observed the men who measured pew spacing and the caterers who smelled like promise and butter. She sat on the church steps and watched the parade of people who came to see and to be seen. Each sash and polite smile deepened something inside her. At night she practiced what she would say. She balanced fear and truth like two bowls of water. She breathed and rehearsed short sentences that could land on a room of polished humanity like a stone on glass. Accusations must be clean. The truth must be simple. Nothing overreaching. If you speak to big, people assume fabrications. If you speak to small, no one hears. She had allies of a certain kind. Mrs. Thompson, a woman who managed Raphael's calendar and the internal comforts of his day, had once crouched on a back step and tied Lena's shoe. She had given Lena a granola bar and advised her in a voice that knew both compassion and boundaries. Mrs. Thompson cared about the little things like the way a cappuccino should be warm to the lip, not too hot, not too cold. Lena had considered telling her everything when she found the recording, but compassion had limits. Mrs. Thompson, for all her warmth, was an employee in a system that demanded plausible normality. Bringing a ragged child into the center of a billion-dollar life with an accusation would have consequences Lena could not predict. The child had nothing to lose and everything to risk. There were nights when she lay in the church and thought of the many children Raphael's foundation had sheltered. She thought of a boy who had learned to read at Anderson's program and now ran his own corner store. She thought of a volunteer who knitted hats and had a laugh that sounded like a choir. What would happen to those programs if control slipped into hands that calculated worth by the size of a ledger? She imagined donation lines cut off, kitchens closed. The small kindnesses that sustained people like her evaporated under the pretense of consolidation. As the wedding drew nearer, she found the courage to act. The recording would have to be heard by someone who could stop the mechanism before signatures were applied, before legal ink could turn a marriage into a takeover. She knew the plan hinged on the immediacy and intimacy of ceremony, the 5-day window after the wedding, the honeymoon suggestions, the signature, in a moment of trust, whatever the exact legal mechanisms. The point was this. They expected complacency. They expected trust. Selena schemed away a small, smart animal does, quietly, without theater. with a focus on the potential for survival. She watched Clara move through rooms, saw the way she positioned people, felt the cold competence of her smile. Clara owned the social stage. Lena owned the knowledge of one small, decisive fact. The recording needed to be in the right hands, at the right time, in a way that could not be dismissed as desperation. She tried to give it to Mrs. Thompson. She waited outside the back door of a service entrance, where Mrs. Thompson left each morning with a tote and a list. Lena stepped forward with the phone and words that were sticky with fear. Mrs. Thompson's face, when she realized the raggedness behind the claim, went through a sequence of pity and protocol. She knelt down and pressed Lena's hand. "You played me," Lena whispered, and held the phone up. "They're saying they'll take everything?" Mrs. Thompson listened, and then swallowed. "Lena, do you understand what you're asking? If this is true, if it is there are steps. We have to be careful." "Careful." Lena's voice cracked. "They're getting married in 3 days. They'll sign things. They'll make it official. You have to." "I will do what I can," Mrs. Thompson said. "But you must understand, people must be protected. You must be protected, too." She hugged Lena, then, awkwardly, like someone trying not to smudge the varnish on a priceless object with her sleeve. It was help, but it was not the thunderbolt the child expected. It was the kind of help that moved in gentle increments. Lena left with the feeling that the church had done its small good deed and then folded matters into procedure. It was better than nothing and not nearly enough. Time telescoped. The wedding rehearsal was an exercise in optics. Raphael watched Clara at the altar and almost believed once more in reshaped life. He rehearsed vows and spoke of kindness, of building something together, phrases that made tabloids write about second chances and fans feel their own loves were blessed. He walked through the ceremony with a careful tenderness that made some guests wipe their eyes. Lena watched it from the shadows of service corridors and supply closet. She observed the security teams and recognized the pattern of their movements. They were polite, efficient, not brutal. They moved like people who had been trained to remove a person from a room without raising a scandal. She watched their faces and thought about how she would need to move to avoid being removed before the truth could be told. The most dangerous part of what she planned was that it required her to enter a place she had no right to enter. This was not bravery offered up as virtue. This was fear and love braided together. Lena considered alternatives: sending the file to a journalist, leaving the recording at Raphael's office, handing it to a legal aid, but each time she imagined the path, she could see the same result: a polite dismissal, a question of credibility. Small people who live in the margins do not always convince the polished. There is a cynicism that greets ragged truth that has more to do with class than with evidence. She practiced her interruption as if it were a script. Quick, simple, unambiguous. No accusations that could be misread as a cry for attention. She would not wave the phone like a prop. She would not shout about legalities. She would deliver the core. Listen to this. They want to steal the foundation. Stop the signing. She guessed that 5 seconds on a playback might be all it took to crack the facade. And then the night before the wedding, Lena sat on the steps of the church, with her cracked phone on her palm, and watched a world that rarely saw her rearrange itself. She saw limousines polishing hide and reflections. She saw an endless procession of faces that meant business at a larger scale than soup lines and shelter mats. She imagined the children who depended on warm meals, the volunteers who gave time, and the staff who coordinated the logistics. She saw them as well as she could see them from her small, present vantage point, and she understood why she could not remain quiet. There were risks. She never stopped counting. If she was taken away by security, would anyone believe her? Would they dismiss her as a disruptive child, a snafu, to be managed? Could the narrow window of ceremony be used against her story? She thought about Mrs. Thompson's careful eyes and the polite nod of the director who organized events. She thought about how people are often willing to believe the prettier lie. She went to bed as best she could on the church's back pew, folding her blanket like a map. Her sleep was fitful. Dreams were not images so much as conversations she ran through in her head. She woke with a throat raw from rehearsal, She picked up the phone and listened to the recording once again. The hiss had a way of making words seem like they belonged to someone else. Still, the core was unmistakable. Power of attorney, the lawyer had said. Once he signs. Clara had laughed like a coin. The business partner had said, no one reads the small print. She moved through the morning like a person wearing a costume of nerves. She replaced a shoelace and pulled on a jacket that had a missing button. She hid the phone inside a knit glove with the speaker facing out. She rehearsed the exact moment she would break into the ceremony and the precise words she would say. She planned to make her way down the aisle like a storm in a teacup, quick and undeniable. What she did not fully plan for was the way people would look at her. When she stepped into the church that day, when she brushed past a woman who flinched at the touch of her sleeve, there was a second in which all normal social balances tipped. The orchestral arrangement of a wedding is nothing if not a choreography of trust people. Assume everyone else has the choreography down. A child who breaks it rewrites the music in an instant. She walked in through a side door that had been propped open with a gavel-shaped wooden block that frowned in the sunlight. Vendors passed by, a florist with soil on her apron, a man with a roll of programs tucked under his arm like a newspaper. Lena moved with the economy of someone who has learned to go unnoticed, and the economy of someone who now must be noticed. Security saw her. Probably not because they had a specific reason to watch this child, but because a child in a wedding is always an anomaly. One of the guards, a man with a kind of jaw that industries use to describe reliability, intercepted her politely. He took one step toward her, ready to ask her to leave. Lena's chest was a drum. She could feel the phone through her glove. She had rehearsed this exact moment. Keep your voice small but hard. Walk to the center. Get in front of Raphael. Play 5 seconds. She would say 3 words and then make the rest happen. She had not planned what would happen to Raphael when he saw her. She had not planned the way his hand would find her and what would happen after that. But then, planning is a kindness often denied to the desperate. Sometimes, actions arrive before the courage to understand them does. As the god reached to guide her out, as the floral azalea glowed like a river of white, something in her ribs pushed forward and she stepped into the light. The world held its breath again, less of a polite stop this time and more of a tension like the final string taut before release. She lifted her hand and pressed the play button. The tiny speaker crackled. Something thin and fierce went through it. For an instant, every sound in the chapel was reduced to a listening. Then the voice filled the room. Legalese and warmth and the casual cruelty of a plan. Once he signs the transfer, we control the accounts, the lawyer said, too ordinary for the enormity of what he was saying. It is a small sound, a small line on a small device. And yet the world in that chapel began to tilt like a painting knocked from its nail. What happened next was a hinge. People moved. Some stared in confusion, others in horror. The guard's hand tightened on Lena's sleeve. The bride's face changed colors as if a filter had been lifted. Raphael's head turned, and in his eyes was confusion braided with a dawning comprehension. Lena knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth had been released into the air. It could be inhaled and dismissed, but it could not be pushed back under the door. What she did not know, what she could not know, from the rawness of her single recorded piece was whether a few seconds of audio would be enough to topple a carefully constructed plan, or whether it would be brushed off as the folly of a street child with a penchant for drama. She had thrown her tiny weight against a gigantic machine. The machine had momentum. The next minutes would tell whether her small hand could stop its turning. The guard began to move toward her, primed to remove the disruptor. Raphael stood, his face a map of emotions. Clara's mouth opened and did not close. The small wooden cross at the front of the chapel caught the light like a lens, and everyone's gaze passed over it as if searching for an answer. The minutes stretched and the room filled with the thin, electric possibility of change. Outside, the city continued in its business ignorance, deliveries, taxi whistles, a child in the distance practicing a skateboard trick on a curb. Inside, fate and proof were now in a collision that could not be undone by polite directions or escorted exits. Lena felt the guard's hand on her arm, and Raphael's attention like a net. She knew that in mere heartbeats, the choice a man could make might be one that would decide not only contracts and money, but the lives of children who had nothing in the world but the shelter of a foundation and the kindness of strangers. She had taken a step that toppled civility. She had begun a story that could end in rescue or in dismissal. Either way, there was no turning back now. The guard's fingers tightened on Lena's sleeve, but Raphael did not move to pull him away. He moved to her instead, without fanfare, as if this were a small, sensible thing he had always meant to do. He reached across a wide aisle and took the girl's hand. The gesture was simple and immediate. It was also, in that chapel, hung with light and expectation, a break in the choreography no one could ignore. Lena's glove was warm and clammy. The phone lay against her palm like a secret heart. Raphael set his other hand on top of hers, and, with a steadiness that belonged to someone used to making decisions in boardrooms in hospitals and at kitchen tables where the bills arrived, he pressed the play button. 5 seconds. A brittle whisper of legalese. A dry laugh. A woman's practiced assurance words that had been arranged to become a trap for a life came out of the cheap speaker and hung in the air like a thrown stone. Those 5 seconds were perfect in their ordinary. They sounded like workday talk, like lunch hour plotting. That was what made them so dangerous. They were not dramatic confessions. They were a blueprint whispered too casually into a small room with a cracked door. Raphael listened. In those 5 seconds, the years of his life condensed the work, the promises he had made after Mara, the evenings, when he had chosen schedules over solitude so that the foundation would not falter. He felt, in a single, private motion, the betrayal of someone who had thought herself trusted. He felt also the raw, bright edge of gratitude toward the child who had set the recording down and risked everything to keep a promise she did not fully know she had made. He stood. The chapel felt smaller and louder all at once. He drew a breath that was not for show. His voice, when it came, did not tremble, but had a new firmness. "We stop this now," he said simply. Someone behind him whispered his name. The guard who had been prepared to escort Lena out froze, uncertain. Clara's smile went taut. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then tried to laugh the way actors do when they realize the curtain has slipped. People murmured. Cell phones tilted upward, screens catching the tilt of a world in which the billionaire had, in an instant, chosen to trust a child over a polished public narrative. Security moved, but this time with a different mandate. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, face threaded with the neat panic of someone who knows both how to keep order and how to keep people safe. A tall man in a suit, one of Raphael's longtime associates, had already pulled his earbud from his shirt and was making a call. There was no dramatic shouting or cinematic coup. There was a series of short, efficient words passed between people who suddenly had a new, unmistakable directive. Preserve truth. Preserve the people in danger. Do not allow the moment to be smothered by spin. Clara reached for Raphael's arm as if instinct would anchor her to possibility. "Raph," she said, voice pitched for the cameras that had not yet been allowed in. "This is nonsense. A child, this is theatrics. You can't let—" He did not answer her. Instead, he gestured to a man in plain clothes who had been tending to last-minute details at the back and said, "Do what you need to do. For everyone's sake, call the authorities." That single sentence carried a weight that made the florist drop a ribbon from her hands. Cameras outside of the chapel, which had been trained on smiling faces, now pivoted to a different tableau. A billionaire choosing immediate transparency over the polished silence that corporate damage control often prefers. Within minutes, though, to the people inside the church, it felt like an hour measured in heartbeats. Uniformed officers arrived. They moved gently and discreetly, mindful of a child present and of the chaos a heavy-handed approach could create. The officers spoke with the event staff, with Raphael's aides, with Mrs. Thompson. Clara and the lawyer were spoken to. The lawyer attempted to frame the conversation as a misunderstanding, as a negotiation mischaracterized by a resentful witness. Clara's voice turned venomous, then pleading. She tried to flip the scene into one of sympathy, of a wealthy man hoodwinked by poor people with stories to tell. But the audio was there. The recording, though thin with static, was direct. It skewered the polite facades with its pragmatic clichés. It spoke of transfers and trustees and of the timetables they had chosen. It was not an accusation so much as evidence of intenta, kind of small, quiet certainties that, when laid out in the light, make something that looked inevitable look criminal. The officers, trained not to make public judgments in the moment, nevertheless acted on the evidence they had encountered. They detained Clara and her lawyer for questioning. The congregation watched as two figures who had been laughing with plates of canops days before were led away, their faces registering a kind of disbelief that was more dangerous than a shout. The business partner was not in the chapel that day. He was, as the days would reveal, working to close the final pieces of the plan from a different place. He would be located and taken into custody in the weeks that followed. Caught not in a single cinematic sweep, but through the ordinary, patient work of investigators tracing wires and signature patterns and paper trails left like breadcrumbs. The capture would be quiet and unromantic. The sort of closure that came with speaking plainly into a microphone and following its echo into paperwork, bank records, and calls. Back in the chapel, the immediate chaos settled into something steadier. Statements, witnesses, the soft hum of phones, with journalists awkwardly trying to get recognized, the murmur of shocked conversation growing into the low roar of a story that would not sleep. Raphael moved through all of it like a man stepping through fog. He leaned over Lena, wrapped a spare shawl he found around her shoulders, an act of instinct more than symbolism, and walked with her to a side room that had been set aside for the flower arranging team. There, in a back room padded with boxers and tissue paper, he sat her down on a folding chair and did the thing that had not been done for years in his own house. He fed a child full-strength soup from a paper bowl and did not excuse himself for the mess. Lena ate, as if each spoonful was a small proof that the world could be sensible again. Her hands shook until the warmth of the bowl steadied them. "You did the right thing," he said when she could look up. The words were simple and heavy, the kind that a man who had built a career on making promises tends to use carefully. "You stopped them." She blinked at him, the way a person does when someone gives them praise the size of a house. She started. Then she stopped. The child inside her did not know all the shapes of gratitude. She only knew what it meant to have roofs instead of open sky, and to be trusted instead of managed. Mrs. Thompson sat down opposite them. Her hands, which had smoothed linens and assembled gifts for board members, now fidgeted with a loose thread on her sleeve. She had an expression that read as both relief and professional concern. "We're going to make sure you're safe, Lena," she said. "No one should take advantage of you." "That's the idea," Raphael replied, and the phrase hung there, not as strategy, but as a contract of the heart. Authorities took statements. There were questions about where the recording had come from, about Lena's presence, about how a child had been able to get so close and why she had not shared the information earlier. Lena answered as truthfully as she could. She did not add. She said what she had seen, what she had heard, what she had feared. Her answers were simple and brutal in their clarity. They were also two people who had come to the chapel as if to witness a harmonious union, a revelation that not all charity is potlucked into the right hands. In the immediate days after, the headlines were sharp and frequent. The city's morning papers called it a scandal. The late-night commentators tried to draw neat moral lines. Social feeds exploded with frames of the moment Raphael had taken Lena's hand. There were, predictably, those who questioned the authenticity of the recording, who suggested a setup. There were others who called the child a hero. There were debates about class and power spun on forums where people traded certainty like change. But beneath the tumult, there was real work. The Anderson Foundation locked down its accounts and performed reviews not as an act of spectacle, but as a matter of stewardship. Raphael insisted on transparency in ways he had not been forced to before. Audits were conducted. Trustees were re-inspected, and those with conflicts of interest were encouraged to step back. He did this not out of performative contrition, but because the possibility of betrayal had made him suddenly, painfully conscious of how dependent fragile systems can be on the goodness of an individual. Clara and her lawyer faced charges. The phrasing of the public statements was careful. Prosecutors said they would examine the evidence. The legal language was cautious on purpose, because the law itself is a place where words must be precise, and public pronouncements can do harm. But the recording, the witnesses, and the unspooling of financial threads were enough to prompt formal action. In time, The business partner who had not been present at the chop was located by investigators and detained. He had moved in the shadows between shell companies and offshore accounts, thinking his tracks were too thin to follow. He had not counted on the doggedness of people who examine ledger lines the way surgeons examine scars. What happened next to Lena was less a headline and more a series of ordinary, meaningful gestures. Raphael could have retreated at the first sign of scandal. He could have hired handlers and shutdowns and built a wall of lawyers to protect the business structure. Instead, in a way that surprised many who had only ever seen his public persona, he acted as if the moral gravity of being the subject of that plot bound him even more tightly to the duty of care. He offered immediate shelter, not a press release about sheltering the underprivileged, but a hand extended to a child who had just stood in a chapel and risked everything. Lena spent her first night off the street in a spare room at Raphael's townhouse that had, for years, been small and practical and lined with books Mara had loved. For Lena, the room was an enormous luxury. Fresh sheets, a bathroom with hot water, a closet where her bag could be emptied and its contents washed and aired without suspicion. Mrs. Thompson, now both his assistant and a steadying adult presence for Lena, sat with her while a social worker from the city arranged temporary protective care. Raphael insisted that the social worker remained involved. He did not assume he had all the answers. He asked for guidance and followed it. He also did something else that surprised the social worker. He removed from his office a framed photograph of Mara and set it in a corner of Lena's new room. He did it quietly, as if he wanted the presence of the woman he had loved to bless this new arrangement. "You should keep reminders of who you are," he told Lena when she noticed the photo. "Mara used to say that people are like houses, with rooms you don't see at first. You have more rooms than you can imagine." She touched the frame, then slid the blanket higher. The gesture was private and gentle. The weeks that followed were a blur of practicalities and small, significant adjustments. Records were taken. Social services performed their assessments. Raphael met with lawyers and, with a tenderness that surprised even himself, asked questions not about paper but about good outcomes for the child in front of him. He asked how to make Lena feel safe, how to ensure she would be respected, and what steps would make the transition into a new life both dignified and stable. At the foundation, people who had once run dinners and afternoon programs were now writing policies and crafting transparency statements. The Anderson Foundation did not change its mission. It expanded it with a kind of sober humility. There were emergency funds set aside for children in crises, additional oversight for trustees, and an effort to reach deeper into neighborhoods that had felt overlooked. As for Lena, the city offered her services a place to stay while things were sorted: counseling, schooling. Raphael paid for private tutoring when Lena's schedule required it. He paid for a doctor to check her vaccinations and a dentist to fix a tooth that had been hurting for months. He was present, but not smothering. He learned the balance between providing and allowing agency, as if he were relearning the language of care in the company of someone who had never had reason to trust generosity before. There were lighter moments, lessons in how to use a dishwasher, the kind of domestic choreography Raphael had avoided in the years of grief, and softer, more human ones. Lena balked at the idea of wearing a blazer. She felt awkward at first in clothes that fit. Raphael tried, awkwardly, to teach her how to knot a tie, then gave up laughing and let her show him how to fold a blanket the way she had always done. Those small, human exchanges mattered more than any press release. They were not for cameras. They were for healing. Less than a year later, after months of guardianship and social welfare processes that were handled with discretion and care, Raphael petitioned to become Lena's legal guardian. The language used in the official documents was cautious, precise, respect-bound. Those who loved him knew the motion was the culmination of a shift they had watched with surprise and gratitude. It was not a takeover. It was an offer, a commitment to provide home, education, and affection. Lena, who had once sat under stained glass and counted the stars through holes in the church roof, now had the solid, steady presence of a man who had been given a second chance at love. The adoption was not an erasure of Lena's past. Raphael insisted that she keep the name she had lived with on the streets. "You are not anyone's project. he would say whenever someone suggested a rebranding. "You are Lena. Keep that. Let's build the rest around you." The wider public followed the story with the fascination of people watching a refinery blaze and then hoping to learn a moral. Some were moved and donated to the foundation because they trusted Raphael. Others donated because they were moved by Lena's bravery. The small aiding groups that had fed her and wrapped her feet in winter socks suddenly found their volunteer lines doubled. The ripple effect was quiet and real. Clara's trial, when it came into public view, was a slow and non-sensational affair of depositions and testimony. The headlines that professed certainty were wrong about the intricacies of the law. But they were right about one thing. The story had damaged reputations. Clara, once a darling of society, found herself having to answer questions about intent in rooms where cameras were not present. The lawyer who had drafted the documents for them faced his own reckonings. The business partner, captured elsewhere, made arrangements that did not undo the evidence already laid bare. It is not for this story to assign perfectly measured retribution. The law took its course, in the patient way institutions do, and the arc of consequence revealed itself in a series of court dates, legal statements, and settlements. What mattered to Lena, and to those who had been watching the chapel split into two worlds that day, was not that the law had been exacting enough, it was that the people who had plotted to take the foundation's power away were no longer able to do so. With the immediate crisis contained, Raphael turned his attention to the long term. How to ensure that the Anderson Foundation would be harder to misdirect in the future. How to protect the children who depended on it. How to create spaces where someone like Lena would never have to sleep beneath a saint again. He established a youth advisory board, insisting that those its programs served should have a voice in how funds were directed. Lena, at first shy, took part. Her voice in a room of adults was not loud, it was precise. She spoke of late openings for shelters, of phone chargers in common rooms, of tutors who would not lecture but would teach in the language of practical life. Her suggestions were sometimes small and sometimes stubbornly sensible. Keep an extra toothbrush kit in the supply closet. Make evening hours for homework help. People laughed at the simplicity of some suggestions, then implemented them. Years folded into themselves. Lena grew. School, which had once been an irregular thing for her, became a steady progression of assignments and friends and small victories. She read books Raphael had loved as a boy, and slowly those books stopped being relics of a different life and started to feel like maps to places she could be. She learned algebra. She learned that talking about fear did not always make the world worse. The relationship between Raphael and Lena was not the neat plot of a romance novel. It was transposed into the ordinary of found family. It had arguments about curfews and awkward holiday dinners where the table felt too big. It had moments where Lena would find the courage to correct him on the proper way to brew coffee or place a picture on a wall. It had evenings when they would sit and look at the stars through a skylight Mara had loved, and Raphael would tell stories of the early days of his businesses, of how he had learned to accept help from friends who pushed back when he wanted to do everything alone. Lena, grown by degrees into a young woman with a steady gaze and an old soul laugh, began to move into roles that were both personal and public. She volunteered at the Foundation's after-school program. She tutored kids who reminded her of the boy who ran the corner store. She spearheaded an initiative to place diaper banks and phone charging stations in shelters, small practicalities that made lives less precarious. She met with Mrs. Thompson every week and with the Youth Advisory Board to plan programming that respected dignity. There were tougher moments, too. Sometimes the old habits of the city would knock at the house's door. The news cycle would bring up images of the chapel again, sometimes framing the chapter as a spectacle rather than as a lesson. Lena, who had learned to carry more than her share of truths, found the attention difficult. She retreated sometimes, took long walks through neighborhoods that smelled of fresh bread and diesel, and found herself returning with new resolve. When she was 18, the board honored her by renaming a small outreach initiative for the children who slept in places where the world did not expect them to be seen. The plaque said little. It was not supposed to scream the moral of the story. It was supposed to mark a place where a child could get a warm meal and a place to study. Years later still, there was a photograph that circulated quietly among those who had been involved from the beginning. It showed Lena at a community event, hair pulled back, hands in a jar of paint, as she and other kids painted a mural on the side of a youth center. Raphael stood a little behind her, smiling, no longer the solitary figure with a private sorrow, but a man who had built a family out of commitment and an old love who had once kept promises to him. The mural itself depicted a bridge, simple, steady, and a small figure walking across it. People would come to the Anderson Foundation and tell their own stories. A teenager who had gotten a scholarship, a mother who had found childcare in a crisis, a man who had learned to open a bakery and employ neighbors who had once been overlooked. The foundation's reach widened, not because money alone fixed everything, but because structure, oversight, and the voices of the people it served started to guide decisions instead of merely waiting for philanthropy to descend. Lena's life did not become untrue. There were moments when the weight of what she had done that day at the chapel returned with a clarity that made her stomach tighten. She had been 12. She had stood in a place built for vows and whispered a truth that appended a life. But she also carried the knowledge that one act, small, brittle as the speaker on an old phone, had altered the direction of countless lives. Sometimes, when she told the story to a room of kids who had come for a Saturday workshop, she would skip the parts that made the room gasp and focus on the details that mattered to them. How she first heard the conversation, how she hid the phone out of sight, how she chose the 5 seconds that she believed would carry the most weight. She emphasized the moral that courage is not always loud, and that courage often smells, at first, like fear. She told them that truth, when articulated plainly, can be its own kind of force. At the center of it all, Raphael kept his promise to Mara in the way he had always wanted to, by making the foundation a place that survived his private grief and extended beyond it into people's lives. He was not a perfect man. He made mistakes. Sometimes he misjudged what Lena needed emotionally. Sometimes he defaulted to managerial solutions when the moment called for tenderness. But he learned, slowly and visibly, to be present in a way that carried with it accountability rather than distance. Clara's name receded from dinner conversations and gossip columns. The legal path she walked through did not become the focus of community headlines. Instead, the story settled into public memory as the moment a small, brave girl interrupted a narrative and forced a city to reckon with what it valued. It became, for many, an emblem of the possibility that a single act of conscience can slow a tide. The found family that grew around Lena was not a neat household of happy endings. It was, instead, a messy, steady thing. Baking, disasters, tutoring sessions that devolved into laughter, quiet moments of grief in the early hours when Raphael would look at a framed photograph of Mara and say her name aloud to a house that felt full and safe. The people who had once been marginalized volunteers, the kids in programs, even Mrs. Thompson were now participants in decisions. They were not sanitized guests on the stage of philanthropy. They were co-creators of the foundation's future. When Lena was 25, the foundation launched a program specifically designed to reduce the number of children who had extended stays in emergency shelters. Lena stood on the stage at the launch event and looked out over an auditorium full of people who had come because they believed in practical change. She told them, simply, that kindness needed structure to last. "We need systems that mean what they say," she said. "We need programs that honor the dignity of each person who walks through our doors and that listen. We also need courage because sometimes the people who will save us are the least expected." There were tears in the room. There were also saves. Volunteers who had been inspired to start night classes. Donors who retooled grants into operational support instead of glossy one-time campaigns. The foundation's work became a model in certain circles, not because it had money, but because it had, in its center, lived experience. Years after the chapel, people still asked Lena how she had done it. She would smile, and sometimes she would say, "I was afraid. I still am. But I knew something had to be said." Other times, she would gesture toward Raphael and say, "And I had someone who listened." The story that began with chaos in a chapel and a cracked phone had, over time, altered countless everyday things. The way volunteers were trained, the lines of accountability at a foundation, the simple practices that made a shelter into a bridge and not a limbo. It had also humanized a billionaire who, rather than retreating behind reputation, stepped toward a responsibility he had inherited with grief and remade it into a life that included an adopted daughter, a stronger foundation, and a city that could say it had done better. In quiet moments, Lena would sometimes visit St. Michael's not to sleep anymore, not to hide, but to remember. She would sit in a pew and watch the light from the stained glass spill onto the floor like shards of color. Once, a child in a hoodie walked up and sat beside her, eyes large with the unsorted questions of someone who had not yet been given a full answer. Lena turned to the child and offered a small packet of cookies she carried in her bag. "You can tell me anything," she said, "or you can just eat." There was a simplicity to the offer that made the child laugh and loosen a small knot of fear they had been holding. That laughter is what Raphael had asked for from the start. Not the tidy resolution of headlines, but the DBD labor of making life gentler for those who had been forced to sleep in corners. The world had been shocked that day the chapel was interrupted. People had blinked at the suddenness of powerful lives colliding with a small, determined voice. Some were shocked by the idea that a child could change the course of a billionaire's wedding. Others were shocked that a billionaire would listen. The true shock, perhaps, was the slow, gentle way the ripples of that moment reshaped the community. Not overnight, but in patient bricks of policy, program, and personal attention. Lena's story became a quiet legend in the city, told not for drama but for its moral. It reminded people that truth, when held by those who are often invisible, can still be heard. It reminded them that courage does not always burn bright. Sometimes it is a small, steady glow that refuses to go out. Years after the arrests and the court dates and the waves of media, Lena would sometimes stand in the foundation's main hall and watch new children arrive, faces marked with the same wary hope she had once had. She would take them on a tour, point out rooms that had once been staff offices and were now art rooms, and tell them, not with triumph, but with a kind of settled joy, that they had places here, that they would have shoes when it snowed, tutors when their math confused them, volunteers who would not look past them but would stand beside them. Raphael would come in after those tours sometimes, carry fewer files, bring hands that shook less with grief than they had in the early years. He would stand at the back and watch Lena lead. And sometimes he would think of Mara and of how small gestures had built a life he could not have imagined. The last image many remember, the one that circulates in the quiet corners of social media and in volunteer newsletters, is of Lena and Raphael planting a small tree outside the youth center on the foundation's 20-year anniversary. Lena was 29 by then. She was stooped slightly as she shoveled, laughing because a clod of dirt flung up on Raphael's shoe and because Mrs. Thompson had insisted on taking a dozen pictures. The tree was not ornate. It was a simple oak sapling destined to grow steadfast over decades, root through years in gentle insistence. They stood afterward with dirt on their hands and the smell of fresh soil in the air, and Raphael placed his hand on Lena's shoulder in a gesture that matched the first one he had made in the chapel years ago, protective, familial, unshackled. It had been a long road from the scrape of marble and the crackle of a cheap phone. "People sometimes ask what changed everything," Lena said later, when asked to speak at a small gathering. "They want a single answer. A headline. A hero. But it wasn't that simple. It was that someone listened. It was that the recording was heard. It was that there were people who chose to make right the work they had started." She paused. The room was quiet. "And it was that people believed a child," she added simply. "That's all. There are moments in public life that scream for spectacle. There are other moments, quieter, that demand only steadiness and an honest hand. The day a mysterious girl disrupted a billionaire's wedding did both. It shocked a roomful of people into seeing what had been hidden. It rearranged lives. It taught a community and a man and a small girl how to become better caretakers of each other. If this story moved you, if you feel like sharing it with someone who believes in the unexpected power of truth and courage, please leave a comment below about what you would have done in that chapel, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how ordinary people can change extraordinary things.